plant kingdom, which is the fourth kingdom according to Whitaker's classification. So we are following Robert Whitaker's classification of living organisms. As we know that living organisms are classified into 5 kingdoms according to Whitaker, which we are following. According to Whitaker's classification, Monera, Protista, fungi, plantae and animalia. Already in the previous chapters we have studied about what are the organisms present in Monera and what are Protista, then fungi, that is the 3 kingdoms. Now we are studying about plant or plantae, plant kingdom, which is the 4th group according to Whitaker's classification. Now plants, as we know, now actually when classification was first studied, Linnaeus classified organisms into plants and animals, and even before that, when we study about the history of classification, living organisms were first classified into plants and animals by Aristotle. So all organisms which do not have the property of locomotion, they are somewhat fixed, he called them as plants. Organisms which possess the power of locomotion, they were called as animals. But however, later it was found that there were no true plants and animals, so that is why the number of the kingdoms went on increasing. So now we are supposed to be interested in the 5 kingdom classification. Now plant, so all structures what we see which are containing chlorophyll, we consider as plants. So generally when a question is asked, what is a plant? We say that it is an organism which is green in color, it contains chlorophyll pigment. But exceptionally majority of the organisms are containing chlorophyll. There are some few exceptions where they are plants but they don't contain chlorophyll. But in general we say that a plant is an organism which contains chlorophyll. Now this plant kingdom is again divided into different divisions. So those divisions are algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So these are the divisions what we study under plant kingdom. So this plant kingdom is a group, 4th group according to Whitaker's classification. Now before going to the study of the different groups of plant like algae, then bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms, we shall study about classification. So when classification was first proposed by different scientists, they proposed their own type of systems. So for example, Whitaker's classification is 5 kingdom, Copeland 4 kingdom, Ernst Haeckel 3 kingdom, Linnaeus 2 kingdom. So like that, according to their own, they gave that system of classification. Now when these systems are considered, on what basis they classify organisms? That is the question. So on what basis some classified organisms into 2 kingdoms, some into 3 kingdoms, some into 4 kingdoms, some into 5 kingdoms, and further how the classification was done, or how they classified the organisms in detail. That is the question which gets arised here. Now when all the systems which are proposed by different authors or scientists, so all these systems which are proposed, they can be grouped under 3 categories. So that means there are 3 types of classification systems. So one type of system is called as artificial system. Another type is called as natural system. Another type is called as phylogenetic system. So if anybody proposes a system of classification, it may be artificial system, it may be natural system, or it may be phylogenetic system. Now what is artificial system? One by one. Which system can be called as an artificial? Suppose if a system or a classification is performed considering only one or very few characters, usually a single character, then it is called as artificial classification. So Linnaeus, for example, Linnaeus classification is a artificial system. So though we say that Linnaeus classified living organisms into plant and animals, but further how plants were classified by Linnaeus. So Linnaeus classified plants into different groups again. Actually he classified into some 21 divisions or 21 groups like that. So we are not bothered about the details of that classification. Now whatever classification he has done, he classified considering a single character, and that is called as artificial classification. And even Aristotle, take for example, Aristotle, he classified living organisms into plants and animals. So plants were further classified into three groups like herbs, shrubs and trees. So on what basis these plants were classified into three groups? When we arise a question or when the question is asked, this classification is done only on the stem character, a single character. So plants which are having soft stem, which does not grow to a large height, and it does not perform or give rise to many branches, very few branches are there, that plant is called as a herb. So that means considering the stem character, plants which are having soft stem, usually green, and not growing to a tall height and not possessing many branches, several branches, it is called as herb. Suppose if a plant is having a hard stem, rigid stem, woody stem with many branches and also does not grow to a large height, it is called as shrub. And again when you take a plant which is having a stem which is growing to a gigantic size, large size, which we call as a trunk, and this trunk grows to a large size and produces many branches at a greater height, we call it as tree. So herb, shrub and trees, they are classified on the basis of stem character, means a single character. So it is an artificial system of classification. So whatever may be the number of groups, we are not bothered about the number of groups. Anyone may classify plants into 5 or 6 groups. Some other may classify plants into 10 groups. Some other may classify plants into 15 groups, and so on. So the number of groups is not important. When the groups are classified or made based on a single character, so we call it as an artificial classification. So Linnaeus had done that. And so there are many other scientists. We are not giving many examples. Next, considering a natural system. So when we considering the organisms based on their natural affinities, considering the external and internal features. See here, in case of artificial, only single character was taken into consideration, like herbs, shrubs and trees, which were classified on the basis of the stem character. Similarly, when you consider the natural affinities of the organisms with relation to their external and internal characters, when that classification is done, it is called as natural classification. Now, for example, a scientist called as Bentham and Hooker, they classified organisms based on the natural affinities, considering the external and internal features. It is called as natural classification. So George Bentham and Joseph Hooker, they proposed a system of their own, which is an example of the natural type of classification. So we are not concerned about how they classified further. So that is somewhat out of our coverage. So that is natural. Next, phylogenetic classification. Now, phylogenetic classification is somewhat highly advanced. So, considering the evolutionary relationships of the organisms as to in what line of evolution, in what way of they have been evolved. So that is called as phylogenetic. So phylogenetic is an advanced type of classification. So whenever anyone who want to propose or do a phylogenetic classification, it is a very deep study. So we have to study their race, from what type of organisms they have been evolved. So based on the evolutionary relationships, they are called as phylogenetic. For example, man. When we compare man to any other animal, so which animal man is related to? When you compare man to amoeba, or when you compare man to any other organism, it may be a fish, or it may be any other organism, it may be earthworm, or like that. So man is closely related to monkey, apes, chimpanzees. So that means in most of the characters he is related. However, there are some differences. Man is highly developed with brain power. Man is walking straight with his legs, but monkey may not be walking with his legs, and monkey may be having low brain power. So these are some differences between human being and that animal. But when we consider other characters, he is closely related. And when we study the evolutionary line, there also there is a relationship. So when we take into account the evolutionary relationships of the organisms and propose a system of classification, it is called as phylogenetic classification. For example, Engler and Prantl, they also proposed, German botanists they are. So this system of classification is called as phylogenetic classification. So many other scientists like Hutchinson, Bessey and Jeshew and various other scientists, they have proposed, they come under different examples. So but what we have to understand is, what are the systems of classification and examples. What is artificial classification? An example of that. What is natural? An example. What is phylogenetic? An example of that. So like that, that is about the systems of classification. So various systems have been proposed. So they are either artificial, natural or phylogenetic. So we get a clear idea or a perfect knowledge or information from the phylogenetic classification. So when you study the artificial classification, it is somewhat less information, or it is one type of study. Natural is a somewhat developed, but it is also a moderate type of classification system. But phylogenetic system, it is taken into account of most of the characters which involve about the evolutionary relationships, and that is proposed, which is an important system of classification. So this is about the systems of classification. Now in addition to this, there are some terms which are related to taxonomy. So taxonomy is the study of classification. So identification, naming and classify organisms is the study of taxonomy. Now in this we come across three types of taxonomy: numerical taxonomy, then cytotaxonomy and chemotaxonomy. So these are the three terms which we have to know before going to the actual groups of this plant kingdom. So what is numerical taxonomy, what is cytotaxonomy and what is chemotaxonomy? Means this is also related to classification, but it is also a system. Here it is somewhat different from this. Now whenever you classify, when classification is done based on the number of the characters used in computers and based on the data processed, that is called as numerical taxonomy. So in the numerical taxonomy, there the characters are taken into account. So the number and the number of the characters which are actually given certain codes, and they are actually used by the use of computers. It is done, and there the database is stored. This is called as numerical taxonomy. So the number and codes are given to the characters of that organism. So in what way the numbers and codes are given, we are not concerned. So we are supposed to know the meaning of the numerical taxonomy. So when we classify organisms, when we observe the characters of a particular organism, certain numbers are given, certain codes are given to the characters. So like that, when numbers and codes are assigned or allotted to different organisms, so there they are processed in the data in computers, and then that is called as numerical taxonomy. Then cytotaxonomy. Cyto means cell actually. It is a Latin word. When we classify based on the cell, now what about the cell? Unicellular or multicellular? Not about the unicellular and multicellular. Now in a cell, the chromosome structure, the chromosome number and the nature of the chromosomes is taken into account. So in the cell, basically we know that the cell contains nucleus. The nucleus contains chromatin fibers. The chromatin, they develop into chromosomes. So the chromosomes, they are well developed or clearly visible during the mitosis, metaphase. So when we take into account the structure of the chromosome, the number of the chromosomes and their arrangement of the chromosomes, so when that classification is done, it is a cytotaxonomy. Now for example, we are not bothered about the other characters, only chromosomes. In human being, the chromosome number is 46. Each cell contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. So this is basically what we know. So when we are saying that there are 23 pairs, 46 chromosomes, and you will take the structure, and when you take another organism which is resembling the structure of our chromosomes and also resembling the number of the chromosomes, not the exact number, it may be very closely resembling. For example, monkey has 22 pairs, 44 chromosomes. So that means we are having 46, that our animal is having 44. So that means They are closely related. So if you take into account the chromosome structure, the chromosome number, and their arrangement also is very important. How they are arranged in the cell. So this study is called as cytotaxonomy. So cytotaxonomy, it is purely about the cell. Cytology, the study of cell, is called as cytology. So cyto means, so wherever we come across the word cyto, it is completely referring to the cell. That is about the chromosome structure, the chromosome number, and the arrangement of the chromosomes, which deals with the cytotaxonomy. Then chemotaxonomy, chemo, chemical. So here chemicals are taken into account. What chemical constituent is present in that organism. Based on the nature of the chemical constituents, that is taken into account and classification is done. So it may be carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and some other inorganic substances they may be. Like that, taking into consideration the chemicals which are present in the organisms, when classification is done by considering the chemical constituents of the organisms, it is called as chemotaxonomy. So like that, numerical taxonomy, cytotaxonomy, chemotaxonomy. So there are different types of taxonomy. So but these three are mentioned in our chapter. So we are concerned only with these three terms. So in addition to this, there are different types of taxonomy. So this is the basic thing what we have to know in the plant kingdom. Now we have to come to what actually this plant kingdom involves. So plant kingdom includes different organisms, group of organisms like algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Now we shall study about algae first. What are algae and about the characteristics of algae, then bryophytes and all that. So in algae we are studying about the characters, classification, then importance of algae. So in algae first we shall study the general characteristics of algae. Then we shall study classification, then the importance of algae. In other words, the uses of algae, what benefits we get from algae. Now, characteristics of algae. Algae are organisms which contain chlorophyll. So when they contain chlorophyll, definitely we can say one point about that. They are independent. They are not depending on other organisms for nutrition. So these organisms, they contain chlorophyll and they do not depend on other organisms. That means they are autotrophic. They are capable of preparing their own nutrition. That is the main important character. They contain chlorophyll. They are autotrophic. And another important thing is the body of algae is called as thallus, or thalloid it is also referred as. Thallus means any plant body which has no true root, true stem, true leaf, or in other words, a plant where root, stem and leaf are not clearly differentiated. There is no clear differentiation of root, stem and leaves. So if you look to that plant body, you cannot point out which is root, which is a stem or which is a leaf. In other words, the true stem, true root and true leaf. That is the thing. Then, so that is called as thallus. So what is thallus? Means it is a plant body which is not having a true root, stem and leaf. So algae is always a thallus. Any example we take, It is an example of thallus. We find thallus in algae only, but there are certain examples in bryophytes also, but not all. But all algae are thalloid in nature. They exhibit the thallus nature of plant body. This is one important character of algae. Then when we come to the organization, how the thallus is there. There are unicellular algae, there are multicellular algae. A single cell may form the body of the algae. For example, Chlamydomonas is one example where it is a single cell algae which is having flagella. So that means algae, when they are unicellular, they may be motile or non-motile. Chlamydomonas is one example which is motile. So the Chlamydomonas cell looks like this. It is having a pair of flagella. It is motile. But there are some non-motile cells, unicellular. For example, volvox. So here the cells, though they are unicellular, they form a colony. They do not remain single. The cells are attached to each other. They are found in groups. And when they are non-motile, how they will move from one place to other place? The outer cells only, they possess flagella, and when these cells they move by the help of the flagella, the whole colony will move. So that means the cells are not separate. The cells form a colony which is very intact. Actually, when we see the structure, we are not going to study. The cells are linked to each other. They are attached. So that means when we pull one cell, the other cells also come along with it. That is how the colony is well united. A very clear union is there. Attachment is there between the cells. And however, there are non-motile cells which also help in locomotion. But in the multicellular, when we come to the multicellular algae, so that algae is also thallus, definitely. It may be in the form of a filament. The cells are arranged in a row like this, and this is called as a filamentous algae. So cells are arranged. So this filament may be simple, unbranched, or sometimes it may be branched. So different filamentous algae are seen which form the thallus. And this algae which is filamentous. And in some other multicellular, where they grow to very massive forms, to a large size, and especially the brown algae and red algae, some red algae, they grow to a very large height. And again, when we speak of the habitat of algae, most of the algae are aquatic. So whenever we want to see algae, most of the algae occurs in aquatic systems. It may be fresh water like a pond, like a lake, or even in running water like rivers, streams. There also algae are found, but most of the algae, aquatic algae, is found in stagnant water like lakes, ponds, like that. Very few aquatic algae are found in flowing streams or this rivers. And there are also algae which are found in marine ecosystems. Marine, that means sea, water. There also we find. So algae may be floating or it may be submerged inside water. Where the water is shallow, means not so deep, where the light penetrates, algae grows attached to certain rocks or to any hard surface inside the water. So there are also algae which are floating. There are also algae which are submerged and found attached to some hard surfaces inside the water. So here, in case of massive forms, in case of multicellular forms, what happens? the algae which grows to a very large height, and such algae which are grown to a very large height, they appear like a plant. Such algae contains stem like structure and also leaf like structure. So, but actually they are not leaves, they are not true leaves, and there are some structures which are resembling the leaves and also stem. So they grow to a very large size, and they reach even up to 60 meters in height. For example, there is one brown algae which is called as macrocystis. It grows to about 60 meters in height. So you can imagine how much 60 meters. So these algae, they are usually found in the sea water, and when they are found in sea water, inside attached, they grow to a very large size and forms what are called as kelps. And these kelps, they are seen inside water. Now kelps means it is just like a forest. For example, when we say forest, what do we mean? It is a growth of thick vegetation, growth of different plants on the land, where you cannot easily pass through them. So that is, we call it as forest. When we are seeing trees around us, we cannot call it as forest. Forest means usually there is a abundant growth of vegetation, a thick growth of vegetation, where you cannot easily pass through, or with some difficulty you may pass. So we call it as forest. Suppose if the same thing is inside water, so there we do not use the word forest there, it is kelps. So usually algae which are attached in the water to rocks or to any hard surface, they grow to a very large height. Just they appear like a somewhat grass or some plants. And these algae, when they are thickly populated, or when there is more density of their growth, they form what are called as kelps. Like this, algae are unicellular, multicellular. They may be in the form of filaments, or they may be forming kelps and grow to a very large size. They are massive forms of algae. Then when we come to the reproduction of algae, how reproduction takes place? So reproduction takes place by three ways: vegetative method, asexual method, and sexual method. So vegetative method means it is usually by fragmentation. So whenever the algae grows, suppose if this filament is cut off and broken into segments, each fragment, which is consisting of a few cells, it will grow into a new organism. It will not die. So that is called as fragmentation. So when the algae filaments, or even in case of multicellular algae, when a part of the algae is broken, is separated into a fragment, each fragment is capable of growing into the new organism. So that is vegetative method of reproduction. And there are also algae where the filaments or that algae body produces certain structures called as bulbils and certain structures called as protonema on their surface. So they separate and grow into a new organism. So that is also by vegetative method. And asexual method. So vegetative, asexual, and sexual. So in asexual method, the algae will produce a kind of unicellular structures which are called as zoospores generally. But actually there are different type of spores which are produced by algae called as hypnospores, planospores, autospores, endospores, etc. So there are different type of spores which are produced by algae. Commonly the zoospores are produced by most of the algae. They are unicellular structures which are released, and each zoospore which is capable of developing into a new organism, that is by asexual reproduction. And in case of sexual reproduction, it is by the production of gametes. When we say sexual reproduction, it is by the presence of the male gamete and the female gamete. So the male and female gametes are produced by the algae. So and again the sexual reproduction may be isogamous, anisogamous or oogamous. So that means when the gametes which are produced, they are both similar, that is called as the isogamous, which where the male and the female gamete cannot be differentiated, and thus it is isogamous. But when the male and female are differentiated morphologically based on the size, which is called as anisogamous. And when the gametes are produced in well defined organs, sex organs, it is called as oogamous type of reproduction. That is how algae are having different characters which are considered as the general characters. Then when we come to the classification of algae, so the classification is very simple. It is divided into three classes. So algae is divided into three classes. So one is class Chlorophyceae, it is one group. Then class Phaeophyceae, this is another group of algae. Then class Rhodophyceae. So these are the three groups which we can classify algae. Algae which is having green pigment, it is Chlorophyceae, commonly called as green algae. Algae which is having brown pigment, brown algae. Algae which is having red pigment, red algae. This is how the classification is done based on the pigments. So green pigment means chlorophyll. Here when we come to the chlorophyll, actually there are different types of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, chlorophyll C and chlorophyll D, and even chlorophyll E. So here there is a type of chlorophyll A and B. Green algae contains A and B type of chlorophyll. They are green, but the content is somewhat different, some chemical composition. Chlorophyll A, B, C and D all are green in color with slight variations. All are involved in photosynthesis, no doubt, but only they differ in some chemical composition. Means when we study the chemical structure of chlorophyll A, B, C and all that, so they differ slightly, but overall they appear green in color. So there is A and B chlorophyll in Chlorophyceae. It is purely green color. So the green algae, what we commonly see in the water or around us. So commonly whenever there is a pond or even on the walls, we see some green mass-like structure or some green color. So that is green algae. Purely it is green algae. And then another important is mostly these are fresh water. Most of the green algae are fresh water. Very few are marine. So that means most of the green algae, they grow in fresh water like ponds, rivers, lakes, like that, whether they are floating or submerged. But very few examples are seen in marine, in sea water. Then the storage product in case of is starch. Starch is the storage product in Chlorophyceae, and in this we come across the Chlamydomonas, which we studied in during the characters, and Spirogyra, then Zygnema. All these are the examples of Chlorophyceae. Then Phaeophyceae means brown algae. Brown algae means we cannot say that there is no chlorophyll. Along with the chlorophyll A and chlorophyll C, there is brown pigment, and that brown pigment is called as fucoxanthin. Now as we say that the green pigment is chlorophyll in plants, So this is a green pigment. Along with the green pigment, chlorophyll A and C, we come across a brown pigment in this algae, and that is why they are called as brown algae, and also they appear brown in color. However, the percentage, the proportion of the pigments is different, but they appear in brown color, so commonly they are called as brown algae, that is fucoxanthin. And the storage product which is seen is mannitol and laminarin in case of brown algae. And these two are mostly marine. This is mostly fresh water. Most of the examples of chlorophyll are growing in fresh water, but most of the brown algae and red algae are marine. Very few examples are seen in fresh water. So when we want to see naturally the red algae and brown algae, so we have to observe in the sea water, marine. So this Phaeophyceae, they are mostly marine, very few, and they contain chlorophyll A and C along with a brown pigment, fucoxanthin. The reserved product, stored product in the cells is mannitol and laminarin, which is a type of carbohydrate. Here starch is the common storage product, but here it is different, another type of polysaccharide, mannitol and laminarin. Then if you come to the red algae, definitely here there is a red pigment, and in addition to this there is a chlorophyll A and chlorophyll D. See, chlorophyll A and B in green algae, A and C in brown algae, A and D in red algae. So A is common in all this, so B, C, D. So that is the difference in this. So the red pigment which is found in this is phycoerythrin. So phycoerythrin is the red pigment. So that is why they appear red in color. So they appear red. And in addition to this, the stored product is Floridian starch. It is a type of starch. The common starch is different. Generally when we speak chemically starch, that is common starch. But in red algae, there is a specific type of starch which is called as Floridian starch. So this Floridian starch is the reserved product of Rhodophyceae, and so those are the characters. So what are the differences between red algae, green algae, brown algae? So we can mention here. So these are having purely green pigment A and B. They are mostly fresh water, and the stored product is starch. And other than green, there is no any other pigment. But in Phaeophyceae, brown pigment is the main. In addition to that, we find chlorophyll A and chlorophyll C. Then the reserved product is mannitol and laminarin, and they are also mostly marine, and very few are fresh water. Rhodophyceae are also mostly marine and few fresh water, and here they contain a red pigment called as phycoerythrin, and in addition to that, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll D. So because of this chlorophyll, so they are autotrophic. They are not depending for nutrition on other organisms. So in the red algae, there is Floridian starch as the reserved product. So then this algae, so that is about the classification of algae. Now after studying the characters, classification, we now study about the economic importance of algae. What are the uses of algae, in other words? So economic importance of algae. So in algae, there are different uses which we come across. First important of algae is more than 50% of the contribution of oxygen to the atmosphere is by algae. So generally when we say that oxygen is released by plants during photosynthesis, so this oxygen which is released by plants, so plants means algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms, all are plants, group of plants. Now which group contributes more oxygen to the environment? So it is the algae which contributes more. So more than 50% of the oxygen which is released into the atmosphere is by algae. That means that is the importance of algae. Suppose, assume, but practically it is impossible. In the whole world, if you remove all the algae out of the earth, whether it is green algae, red algae or brown algae, you remove all the algae which is existing in water, you remove from the habitat. So then the contribution of oxygen, the presence of oxygen will be reduced to 50%. So that means about 50% most of the oxygen is contributed by algae. So that is about the importance of algae. Then when we say about algae, what I was telling about they are fresh water and marine. There are also algae which are growing on land, but moist soils, not purely water. In damp soils, in wet soils, and even on the surface of the rocks, wet rocks, and even on the wet walls they grow. Even on the tree, barks of the tree, there are algae which are growing, but that medium should contain moisture. So in moisture containing medium, that algae is growing. So here that is one important. So most of the oxygen, about 50% of the oxygen is contributed by algae itself. That is one. Then another important is there are certain algae which are used as food for our nutrition. In some countries it is commonly done. So as we are using certain plants as vegetables, there in some other countries where the land area is very less, where that country is surrounded by sea or aquatic medium, there the algae are used as food material. For example, if you take Japan or any other small country which is all around surrounded by sea, but the land mass is very little. So if they depend on the plants growing on land, the land is very little. So that is why all that population is not cannot be provided from the plants growing on the land. That is why, so they depend on the resource for nutrition from the sea. So there the kelps, what I have said, certain brown algae which are growing nearby the shores, which are forming kelps. So they cut those kelps and they use as food material. For example, there is one brown algae which is called as ulva, or it is called as sea lettuce. Then there is an algae called as fucus. There is an algae called as the laminaria. So laminarin, what we say, there is an algae called as laminaria, and dictyota, there is one algae. So these algae, they are used as food, as we are using some vegetables growing on the land. So that algae is used as food, and they provide nutrition. In addition to this, algae also provide certain chemical products like algin and also carrageenan. So this algin is one product which is obtained, and there is one called as carrageenan, which is a chemical which is extracted from certain red algae, and they are used for various purposes. Algin is used as a for stabilizing emulsions, and it is also used in certain industries, and carrageenan is also used in brewing industries and also in textile industries. So various uses of algae can be done. All these are obtained from brown algae and red algae. So in addition to that, algae are also used as an antibiotic. For example, chlorella is one such kind of algae where we can use an antibiotic from them. Then there are certain algae where the algae which are used for various purposes. For example, in case of certain algae, agar is obtained, which is used in canning of fish, means preservation of the fish which is not spoilt for a long time, and that is one use of algae. So like that, the main uses of algae, one is the contribution of oxygen, the used as food, for example ulva, fucus, laminaria and many others. And there are certain brown algae where algin is extracted, which is used in stabilizing the emulsions and also in making certain products, and carrageenan, which is used in the brewing industries, and also it is used in the preparation of certain ice creams and even pastes also. It is used. Agar, which is actually it is a component of culture medium. It is a very important, especially in the study of genetics. When certain microbes or microorganisms are to be studied, like bacteria, they are grown in a artificially cultured medium. In tissue culture we come across that. So there the artificial medium which is prepared, it contains agar. So agar is a kind of boost, we can say, for the growth of microbes, where we can study perfectly, and that is one important use of agar. It is also used in making ice creams and various other products there. Then chlorella, I said it is used as an antibiotic, chlorellin. Like that, algae are having various uses which we can say about the economic importance. So this is about one group of plant kingdom. So algae is one group. So in this algae we are supposed to know the general characters of algae, then classification of algae. So there are only three classes which are based on the type of the pigment what they contain, and other than this we have to know the economic importance of the algae. So economic importance means actually it is the beneficial effects of algae. So when we are saying about beneficial effects, so one question will arise, are there some harmful effects of algae? But we are not studying that. So to just mention here, there is one algae which is parasitic. It is pathogenic. It causes a disease in coffee plant. There is an algae which is called as cephalourus. So it causes a disease called as red rust disease in this coffee plants. So we are not supposed to study about the harmful effects. So economic importance here, for the time being, we are concerned only with the uses of algae. So that is about the group of algae. So in the next part we will be studying about the bryophytes, characters of bryophytes and classification of bryophytes, and pteridophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms.